The morning sun cast long shadows across the red earth of Ouagadougou as Captain Ibrahim Traore received the official summons. The document bore the seal of the High Court, but its weight felt heavier than any military order he had ever carried. His aide, Lieutenant Sankara, stood at attention beside his desk, watching as the captain's weathered fingers traced the formal language that masked a deeper truth. Constitutional inquiry into executive conduct, Traore read aloud, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. Regional destabilization, abuse of military authority. He set the paper down carefully. They've finally decided to try this route. Lieutenant Sankara shifted uncomfortably. Captain, sir, perhaps we should— No. Traore's interruption was gentle but firm. We knew this day would come. The question was never if, but how. He stood from behind his desk, moving to the window that overlooked the military compound. Below, soldiers went about their morning routines, unaware that their leader's fate hung in the balance of a carefully orchestrated legal proceeding. For months, Captain Traore had been a thorn in the side of the established order. His anti-corruption campaigns had exposed networks of embezzlement that reached into the highest echelons of government. His calls for sovereignty had challenged foreign mining contracts that left Burkina Faso's gold flowing out while its people remained poor. His speeches about dignity and self-determination had inspired a generation of young Africans who saw in him something they had rarely witnessed, a leader who couldn't be bought. The response had been swift and multifaceted. First came the whispers, rumors of instability, questions about his mental state, suggestions that he was becoming too radical. Then came the economic pressure, frozen accounts, delayed supplies, diplomatic isolation. When those failed, they tried direct intimidation, veiled threats, suspicious accidents befalling his allies, mysterious power outages during his public addresses. But Traore had weathered it all with the same calm determination that had made him a respected military officer. He understood that his true crime wasn't constitutional overreach or regional disruption. His crime was hope. He had given his people something dangerous, the belief that they deserved better. Now they were taking their final shot. The Supreme Court building in Ouagadougou had never seen such activity. By dawn, 3 days before the hearing, journalists from across West Africa had begun arriving. International news crews set up their equipment along the palm-lined Avenue de l'Indépendance. Local radio stations broadcast continuous coverage, their voices crackling through the dry harmattan wind that swept across the city. Inside the court building, Chief Justice Amadou Konaté stood in his chambers, staring at a photograph on his desk. His grandson, barely 5 years old, smiling gap-toothed at the camera. The boy lived with his daughter in Abidjan, studying at a French-funded school, dreaming of becoming a pilot. Justice Konaté had worked for 30 years to give his family opportunities he never had. Now all of that hung in the balance. 3 days earlier, he had received visitors. They didn't announce themselves as representatives of any particular government or organization. They simply arrived at his home after sunset, impeccably dressed men who spoke in soft tones about mutual interests and regional stability. Justice Konaté, the lead visitor had said, settling into the chair across from him in his living room, "You have built something admirable here. Your reputation for fairness is renowned. Your family's success is inspiring." The justice had said nothing, waiting. "The Traore situation presents complexities. We understand your position is difficult, the pressure you must feel from various quarters. We simply want you to know that your dedication to justice, true justice, not the theatrical kind, would not be unnoticed or unrewarded." They had left 3 things: a briefcase containing more money than the justice made in 5 years, a scholarship offer for his grandson at one of Europe's most prestigious universities, and a very clear understanding of what would happen to his family if he chose unwisely. Now, standing in his chambers, Justice Konate felt the weight of 30 years of jurisprudence pressing down on him. He had sworn an oath to uphold the law without fear or favor. But what was the law when it was being used as a weapon? What was justice when it was purchased with briefcases full of foreign currency? His assistant knocked softly. "Your Honor, the prosecutor has arrived for the preliminary briefing." Justice Konate straightened his robes and prepared to meet with the man who would argue for Traore's immediate arrest. Prosecutor General Marcel Ouedraogo had not slept well in weeks. A career civil servant who had worked his way up through the ranks with meticulous attention to detail and an unblemished record, found himself in the most challenging position of his professional life. The case against Captain Traore was simultaneously the strongest and weakest he had ever handled. Strongest because the political pressure was immense and the resources were unlimited. Weakest because the evidence was largely circumstantial and the charges were transparently political. As he reviewed his files for the 100th time, he reflected on the path that had brought him here. Born in a village without electricity, he had studied by candlelight to earn his law degree. His first job had been defending small farmers against land grabbers. He had built his reputation on protecting the vulnerable against the powerful. Now he was being asked to do precisely the opposite. The preliminary evidence meeting with Justice Konate was perfunctory. Both men understood their roles in the larger drama. The charges were read, the procedure explained, the timeline established. But beneath the formal language, a deeper conversation was taking place. The international community is watching. There are expectations about how this will proceed.
Justice Konate nodded slowly. "The law will be followed, prosecutor, whatever the expectations." "Of course, Your Honor, though I trust you understand the complexities involved." "I understand many things, prosecutor, including my oath." After Ouedraogo left, Justice Konate remained in his chambers, staring out at the city where he had practiced law for 3 decades. Somewhere out there, Captain Traore was preparing for what might be his final public appearance as a free man. Somewhere else, powerful people were finalizing their plans to ensure this proceeding reached the conclusion they desired. And somewhere in Abidjan, his grandson was learning to read, blissfully unaware that his future hung in the balance of his grandfather's decision. Captain Ibrahim Traore spent the evening before his court appearance not in strategy sessions with lawyers, but walking through the neighborhoods of Ouagadougou where he had grown up. He moved quietly through the narrow streets, past the small shops closing for the night, past the families gathered around their evening meals, past the children playing football in the dusty courtyards. Few recognized him in civilian clothes, without his military uniform or official entourage. He was just another middle-aged man taking an evening walk, stopping occasionally to buy ground nuts from a street vendor or to greet an elderly neighbor. But those who did recognize him saw something in his eyes, not fear, but a deep sadness, not for himself, but for what this moment represented. The trial tomorrow wasn't just about him. It was about whether a small African nation could chart its own course, or whether the old patterns of external control would reassert themselves under the guise of legal proceedings. At a small mosque near his childhood home, he stopped for evening prayers. The imam, a man who had known him since boyhood, offered no special recognition. In the presence of the divine, all men were equal. Rich or poor, powerful or powerless, everyone knelt on the same worn carpets and submitted to the same eternal truths. After prayers, as they walked together in the cooling air, the imam spoke quietly. "Tomorrow will be difficult, Ibrahim." "Yes, uncle." "Remember that strength is not in fighting every battle, but in knowing which battles are worth fighting. Traore nodded. And how do you know which battles are worth fighting? The old imam smiled. The battles that aren't really about you. That night, in his modest quarters, Traore wrote letters, one to his wife, expressing his love and his hope that their children would grow up in a Burkina Faso where dignity was not negotiable. One to his officers, reminding them that their duty was to the people, not to any individual leader. And one to the young people who had seen in him a symbol of change, encouraging them to never abandon their dreams of a better future. He sealed the letters and placed them in his desk drawer. Tomorrow, he would face whatever came with the same calm determination that had guided him through years of military service. Win or lose, he would stand with dignity. The Supreme Court of Burkina Faso had never been the center of such intense attention. By 5 o'clock in the morning, people had begun gathering outside the imposing colonial-era building with its distinctive arched windows and red tile roof. Street vendors appeared as if summoned by an invisible signal, selling coffee, bread, and newspapers to the growing crowd. International journalists interviewed anyone willing to speak. Local television crews broadcast live updates every few minutes. Radio stations across West Africa interrupted their regular programming to provide continuous coverage of what many were calling the most important legal proceeding in the region's recent history. Inside the courthouse, security was unprecedented. Metal detectors that hadn't been used in years were hastily installed. Police officers checked identification multiple times. The usual casual atmosphere of the building had been replaced by a tense formality that made everyone speak in whispers. Justice Konaté arrived at his chambers at 6:30, 2 hours before the scheduled proceedings. His robes hung pressed and ready, but he made no move to put them on. Instead, he sat at his desk and opened a worn copy of the Constitution of Burkina Faso, the document he had sworn to uphold. Article 101. The judicial power is independent of the legislative and executive powers. Article 103. Judges are independent in the exercise of their jurisdictional functions. The words that had once inspired him now felt like both a promise and a challenge. His assistant knocked. "Your Honor, there are some gentlemen here to see you. They say it's urgent." Justice Konaté's blood ran cold. He had hoped they would trust him to follow through on their implicit agreement. Apparently, they wanted to be certain. "Show them in." The same well-dressed men who had visited his home entered his chambers. This time, they carried no briefcases, made no offers. Their message was simpler and more direct. Justice Konaté, we trust you understand the gravity of today's proceedings. For everyone involved. They left without another word, but their meaning was unmistakable. The choice was no longer between principle and reward. It was compliance and consequences. At precisely 9 o'clock, Captain Ibrahim Traore's vehicle pulled up to the courthouse. The crowd that had been murmuring and shuffling fell into complete silence. Even the journalists stopped their chatter. The moment had arrived. Traore stepped out alone. No security detail, no legal team, no advisors. He wore his military uniform, but it was notably free of the ceremonial decorations that marked his rank and achievements. Instead, he wore the simple fatigues of a working soldier, cleaned and pressed but unpretentious. The walk from his vehicle to the courthouse entrance took less than 2 minutes, but it felt like a march through history. Every step was photographed, recorded, analyzed. His expression remained calm, his pace steady. He acknowledged no one in the crowd,
but his presence acknowledged everyone. Inside the courthouse, he was met by his court-appointed legal counsel, a young attorney named Fatimata Sawadogo, who had volunteered for the assignment when more senior lawyers had declined or been pressured to refuse.
"Captain," she said nervously, "we should discuss strategy. The prosecutor will likely move for immediate detention. We need to prepare our response." Traore studied her face, earnest, intelligent, frightened. "What do you think our chances are, counselor?" She hesitated. "Legally? The charges are weak. The evidence is circumstantial. In a fair proceeding, they would be dismissed. And in an unfair proceeding? Captain, She trailed off, unable to voice what they both knew. "It's all right," Traore said gently. "You've already shown more courage than most by being here. Whatever happens today, you've honored your profession." Courtroom 1 of the Supreme Court building had been transformed. Additional seating had been installed to accommodate the unprecedented number of observers. International diplomats sat alongside local officials, foreign correspondents next to traditional chiefs, human rights observers beside government ministers. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. Everyone understood they were witnessing a moment that would define not just Captain Traore's fate, but the future of democratic institutions in Burkina Faso. At the back of the courtroom, partially hidden behind the official observers, sat the men who had visited Justice Konaté. They watched everything with the patience of people confident in the outcome. Occasionally, one would check his phone or whisper briefly to a colleague, but mostly they simply observed. Near the front, in the section reserved for family members, sat Traore's wife, Salamata. She wore traditional dress in the colors of the Burkinabe flag, red, white, and green. Her presence was quiet but powerful, a reminder that behind the political drama was a family, a community, a life that could be forever changed by the day's proceedings. The court clerk, a woman who had worked in the building for 20 years, called for order as Justice Konaté prepared to enter the courtroom. She had seen many important cases, but never one where the very foundations of the legal system seemed to be at stake. Justice Amadou Konaté paused outside the courtroom door, his hand on the handle. Through the wood he could hear the subdued murmur of conversation, the rustle of papers, the scraping of chairs. In a few moments, he would walk into that room and take his place at the bench where he had presided over thousands of cases during his career. But none of those cases had prepared him for this moment. He thought of his grandson in Abidjan, probably having breakfast at this very moment, preparing for another day of school, where he was learning to read and write in French, where he was being taught that education and hard work could open any door, where he believed that justice was real and that good men could make a difference. He thought of the briefcase of money hidden in his home, more wealth than he had ever imagined possessing, enough to secure his family's future for generations, enough to buy silence, compliance, complicity. He thought of the veiled threats, the subtle pressure, the understanding that his family's safety depended on his cooperation. And he thought of the oath he had taken 30 years ago, as a young lawyer who believed that the law could be a force for justice, that courts could be sanctuaries of truth, that a judge's robes carried the weight of moral authority. The door opened, and he stepped into the courtroom. "All rise." The familiar words echoed through the packed courtroom as Justice Konaté took his place at the bench. The formal ritual of court proceedings began, the reading of the case number, the identification of the parties, the statement of charges. But everyone present understood that what was really beginning was a test of whether the rule of law could survive when it conflicted with the rule of power. Prosecutor General Odrogo rose to present the state's case. His voice was steady, professional, betraying none of the inner turmoil he felt. The charges were serious: constitutional overreach, abuse of military authority, threatening regional stability, actions prejudicial to state security. "Your Honor," Odrobo began, "the evidence will show that the defendant has consistently exceeded his legitimate authority, undertaken actions that destabilize our nation's institutions, and posed a clear and present danger to the constitutional order of Burkina Faso." As he spoke, outlining the prosecution's case with practiced precision, Traore sat motionless in the defendant's chair. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes were alert, watching not just the prosecutor, but the judge, the observers, the security personnel positioned around the room. The case Odrogo presented was carefully constructed. Yes, the evidence was largely circumstantial. Yes, many of Traore's actions could be interpreted as legitimate military operations. But taken together, the prosecutor argued, they formed a pattern of behavior that threatened the stability of the state. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Odrogo continued, "the state has reason to believe that the defendant may attempt to flee the jurisdiction or interfere with ongoing investigations. Therefore, we respectfully request that the court order his immediate detention pending a full trial." This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The request for immediate arrest, the legal maneuver that would remove Traore from public life and send a clear message about the consequences of challenging established power. In the gallery, journalists leaned forward, cameras focused, recording devices active. This was the climax towards which the entire proceeding had been building. Attorney Fatimata Sawadogo rose to respond, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged her papers. At 28, she was arguing the most important case of her young career in front of more observers than she had ever addressed. "Your Honor," she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "the prosecution's case is built on speculation, political grievance, and mischaracterization of lawful military actions. Captain Traore has served his country with distinction for over 15 years. His record shows not abuse of authority, but dedication to the principles of sovereignty and anti-corruption that every citizen of Burkina Faso should support."
The movement was not sudden or dramatic. It was calm, professional, deliberate. But in the charged atmosphere of the courtroom, it had the effect of a lightning strike. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, cameras swung toward the officers, security personnel around the room tensed, uncertain about their role in this unexpected development. Captain Traore, still seated at the defense table, noticed the movement but did not react. His expression remained calm, resigned. He had expected this possibility. Despite the judge's ruling, the forces arrayed against him had other plans. The officers began walking toward the front of the courtroom, their path taking them directly toward Traore's position. Their credentials, visible now on their belts, identified them as belonging to a special security unit that operated outside normal legal channels, a unit known for handling sensitive cases where normal legal procedures were considered inadequate. In the gallery, journalists began frantically typing and filming. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the dramatic confrontation that would define the story. Would Traore resist? Would his supporters intervene? Would the court's authority be respected or overruled by force? Justice Konate watched the officers approach, his mind racing. He had made his legal decision, but he was rapidly learning that legal decisions were only as powerful as the willingness to enforce them. As the officers reached the barrier separating the gallery from the well of the court, Justice Konate did something that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He stood. Not the formal rising that marked official court pronouncements, but a sudden decisive movement that commanded immediate attention. His right hand came up, palm forward, in a gesture that was unmistakably a command to stop. "Halt!" he said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent courtroom. The officers paused, uncertain. They had their orders, but they were standing in a court of law, before a sitting judge who had just issued a direct command. "This is a courtroom," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Not a battlefield, not a theater, not a tool for intimidation. This is a place where the law governs, and I am the representative of that law." The atmosphere in the room had changed completely. What had been a legal proceeding had become a direct confrontation between judicial authority and executive power. "Officer," Justice Konate addressed the lead man directly, "by whose authority do you propose to make an arrest in my courtroom?" The officer hesitated, clearly unprepared for this challenge. His orders had been simple: arrest Traore when the moment was opportune. No one had briefed him on what to do if the judge intervened. "Your Honor," the officer finally said, "we have orders." "Orders from whom?" Justice Konate interrupted. "This court has just ruled that there is no legal basis for detention. Are you suggesting that there is some authority higher than the law?" In the back of the courtroom, the well-dressed men were no longer patient observers. One was speaking urgently into his phone. Another was gesturing toward the door, apparently signaling to someone outside. But Justice Konate's attention was focused entirely on the officers before him. "You do not carry authority in this courtroom. The law does, and the law is not afraid." Throughout this confrontation, Captain Traore had remained seated, but not participating. Now, as the tension in the room reached its peak, he slowly stood. The movement was careful, deliberate, non-threatening. But his presence, standing in the well of the court while officers with handcuffs faced off against a judge defending his authority, was electric. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm and clear, "may I address the court?" Justice Konate nodded, grateful for the momentary reduction in tension. Traore turned first to the officers, then to the crowded gallery, and finally back to the judge. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who understood that this moment would define not just his own fate, but the meaning of justice in his country. "Is this how we treat those who serve?" he asked. "Is this what justice has become, a stage for silencing those who speak uncomfortable truths?" He looked directly at the officers, his expression sad rather than angry. "To you, officers, I bear no ill will. You did not write this script. You are following orders as soldiers do. But I will not help you perform this theater. I will not make it easy for those who would use the law as a weapon." The officers looked uncertain, glancing between Traore, the judge, and the back of the courtroom where their real instructions were coming from. Traore turned to Justice Konate. "Your Honor, you have reminded us today what a courtroom should be. You have shown that the law can still mean something, that justice can still have dignity. Whatever happens next, that moment will not be forgotten." For long moments the courtroom was frozen in tableau, the judge standing at his bench, one hand still raised in command. The officers caught between conflicting authorities, their handcuffs visible but unused. Captain Traore standing calmly between them, neither resisting nor submitting. The packed gallery holding its collective breath. In that silence, everyone present understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Not just a legal proceeding, but a fundamental test of whether the rule of law could survive when confronted by the rule of power. The officers looked again toward the back of the courtroom, clearly waiting for guidance. But the well-dressed men had gone still.
apparently recognizing that the situation had evolved beyond their carefully laid plans. Any intervention now would be too obviously political, too clearly an overriding of judicial authority. Justice Konate seized the moment. "Officers, you have heard this court's ruling. Captain Traore is not subject to detention at this time. I direct you to return to your seats and allow these proceedings to continue according to law." It was a direct command from a sitting judge in his own courtroom. To disobey would be to openly reject the authority of the judicial system itself.
The lead officer looked one more time toward the back of the room, then slowly moved his hand away from the handcuffs at his belt. "Yes, Your Honor," he said reluctantly. As the officers returned to their seats, a collective exhale seemed to rise from the gallery. The immediate crisis had passed, but everyone understood that the larger confrontation was far from over. Justice Konate resumed his seat, but the formal rhythm of the court proceeding had been permanently disrupted. What had begun as a legal hearing had become something much more significant, a public demonstration of the tension between law and power, between justice and politics. "This court will now address the scheduling of future proceedings," Justice Konate announced, returning to the mundane but necessary business of legal administration. As lawyers discussed dates and procedures, Captain Traore remained standing, understanding that while he had won this particular battle, the war for his freedom and for his country's future was far from over. In the gallery, journalists were already composing their reports. The story would be carried across Africa and around the world within hours. A judge had stood up to pressure. An arrest had been prevented. The rule of law had prevailed, at least for one day. But the well-dressed men in the back of the courtroom were also making their plans. They had underestimated the judge's willingness to resist, miscalculated the power of public scrutiny, failed to account for the unpredictable dynamics of a legal system under pressure. They would not make the same mistakes twice. When Justice Konate finally gavelled the session to a close, Captain Traore walked out of the courtroom the same way he had entered, alone, dignified, unhurried. But the walk felt different now. He was no longer just a defendant in a political trial. He had become a symbol of something larger, the possibility that principle could triumph over power, that courage could overcome intimidation, that justice could still mean something. The crowd outside the courthouse had grown throughout the morning. Word of the dramatic confrontation inside had spread through social media, radio reports, and the traditional networks of information that connected communities across Burkina Faso. As Traore emerged from the building, the crowd fell silent. Then, slowly, applause began. Not the wild cheering of a political rally, but the sustained, respectful applause of people who had witnessed something important and wanted to acknowledge its significance. Traore acknowledged the crowd with a slight nod, then walked to his vehicle. As he drove away, the image was captured by dozens of cameras. A soldier who had stood up for his principles, a judge who had defended his courtroom, a moment when the law had meant more than the power behind it. Within hours, the footage from the courtroom was circulating globally. International news networks led with the story of the African judge who had stood up to pressure, the military officer who had faced down intimidation, the courtroom where justice had prevailed against the odds. In capitals across Europe and North America, diplomatic officials who had been preparing statements condemning Traore's arrest were forced to recalibrate their responses. The narrative they had expected, a military strongman being brought to justice, had been replaced by something more complex, a story of legal courage in the face of political pressure. Human rights organizations praised Justice Konate's defense of judicial independence. Legal scholars analyzed the confrontation as a case study in the dynamics of law under pressure. African intellectuals and activists saw in the moment a symbol of the continent's ongoing struggle for genuine self-determination. But the most powerful responses came from ordinary people across Africa, who saw in the day's events something they had rarely witnessed: their own leaders standing up for principles rather than bowing to pressure, their own institutions functioning as they were supposed to function, their own dignity being defended in international forums. That evening, Justice Konaté sat in his chambers, still wearing his judicial robes, staring at the same photograph of his grandson that had been on his desk that morning. The boy's innocent smile seemed to ask a question. Was it worth it, grandfather? Was defending principle worth risking everything we've worked for? The judge's phone had been ringing constantly since the hearing ended, reporters wanting interviews, colleagues offering congratulations and warnings, family members calling to express pride and concern. But the call he had been dreading finally came just as the sun was setting over Ouagadougou. "Justice Konaté," the familiar voice was calm, businesslike. "You've had a busy day." "I've done my job," the judge replied simply. "Yes, you have, very publicly, very impressively. The international media seems quite taken with your performance." A pause. Of course, performances have consequences, for everyone involved. The line went dead. Justice Konaté set down the phone and looked again at his grandson's photograph. In 6 hours, he had gone from being a cooperative participant in a carefully orchestrated proceeding to being an international symbol of judicial courage. He wondered if the boy would ever understand the choice his grandfather had made, and whether he would think it was the right one. As night fell over Burkina Faso, Captain Traore sat in his quarters, writing in a journal he had kept throughout his military career. The day's events had been extraordinary, but he understood better than anyone that they represented only one move in a much longer game. His enemies had been temporarily outmaneuvered, but they had not been defeated. At any rate, his public victory in the courtroom had made him more dangerous to them and therefore more vulnerable to escalated retaliation. The attempted arrest in court was crude, obvious, easily thwarted by a principled judge and public scrutiny. Their next move would be more sophisticated, less visible, harder to defend against. She went through the charges methodically, demonstrating how each could be explained as legitimate exercise of military authority. The operations the prosecution characterized as destabilizing, she argued, were efforts to combat smuggling and corruption. The speeches they called inflammatory she described as calls for national dignity and self-determination. Most importantly, Your Honor, she concluded, Captain Traore has voluntarily appeared before this court. He has not fled, he has not resisted, he has submitted himself to the legal process as is proper for any citizen. The prosecution's request for detention is premature, unnecessary, and contrary to the presumption of innocence that is fundamental to our legal system. Her argument was solid, legally sound, and passionately delivered. In a normal courtroom, under normal circumstances, it might have been enough. But as she sat down, everyone in the room understood that this was not a normal courtroom, and these were not normal circumstances. Justice Konaté called for a brief recess to consider the prosecution's request. As the courtroom emptied for the 15-minute break, he remained at the bench, staring down at the legal briefs before him without really seeing them. The law was clear. Without compelling evidence of flight risk or danger to the community, detention was inappropriate. The prosecution's case, while politically motivated, was legally weak.
A fair application of judicial standards would deny the request and allow Traore to remain free pending trial. But fairness, the justice now understood, was not the standard by which this case would be judged. He thought of his grandson, innocent and trusting, depending on his grandfather's decisions for his future opportunities. He thought of his daughter, who had worked so hard to build a life in Abidjan, who trusted that her father would protect the family he had always provided for. He thought of the well-dressed men in the back of the courtroom, patient and confident, certain that their investment in intimidation would pay the expected dividends. And he thought of Captain Traore, sitting calmly in the defendant's chair, a man who had risked everything for principles that seemed increasingly quaint in a world where power trumped law, where foreign interests shaped domestic decisions, where justice was just another commodity to be bought and sold. The 15 minutes passed in what felt like both an eternity and an instant. "All rise." Justice Konate returned to the bench, his face revealing nothing of the internal struggle he had endured during the brief recess. The packed courtroom fell silent, every person present understanding that they were about to witness a moment that would define not just this case, but the future of justice in their country. In the matter of the prosecution's request for detention, Justice Konate began, his voice steady and formal. The court has carefully considered the arguments presented by both sides. He paused, and in that pause the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The charges against Captain Traore are serious. The prosecution has outlined concerns about flight risk and potential interference with investigations. These are legitimate considerations that the court must weigh carefully. In the gallery, the well-dressed men leaned forward slightly. This sounded like the beginning of an approval for their request. However, Justice Konate continued, and that single word seemed to change the entire atmosphere of the room. The law requires more than allegations and concerns. It requires evidence. It requires proof. It requires adherence to the fundamental principle that a person is innocent until proven guilty. The silence in the courtroom was now complete, absolute. Even the sounds from the street outside seemed to have faded away. The prosecution has failed to present compelling evidence of flight risk. Captain Traore has appeared voluntarily before this court. He has cooperated with legal process. He has shown no indication of attempting to evade justice. Justice Konate looked directly at the prosecutor, then at the defense table, and finally at Captain Traore himself. Furthermore, the court notes that the charges, while serious, are largely political in nature. The actions described by the prosecution could equally be characterized as legitimate exercise of military authority in service of anti-corruption efforts and national sovereignty. At the back of the courtroom, one of the well-dressed men checked his phone and whispered urgently to his colleague. Therefore, Justice Konate continued, his voice growing stronger, the court denies the prosecution's request for immediate detention. Captain Traore will remain free pending trial, with the understanding that he will appear for all scheduled proceedings. The courtroom erupted, not in celebration or protest, but in a kind of shocked murmur as people processed what they had just witnessed. The judge had defied expectations. He had applied the law as written, rather than as demanded. But the most dramatic moment was yet to come. As Justice Konate prepared to continue with the procedural aspects of the hearing, two plainclothes officers who had been seated inconspicuously in the gallery suddenly stood up. Their hands moved to their waists, where the outline of handcuffs was visible under their jackets.
Traore closed his journal and walked to the window. Across the city, in homes lit by kerosene lamps and fluorescent bulbs, families were discussing the day's events. Children who had been in school were hearing from their parents about the soldier who had stood up to power, the judge who had defended the law, the moment when justice had meant something real. For tonight, that was enough.
In a secure compound on the outskirts of the city, the well-dressed men who had orchestrated the day's failed operation were conducting their own after-action review. The room was sparse, a few chairs, a table, communications equipment, but the conversation was intense. "The judge was supposed to be cooperative," one man said, his accent suggesting origins far from West Africa. "Our intelligence indicated he would follow instructions." "Our intelligence was wrong," replied his colleague, a local man who had spent 20 years navigating the complex networks of power that governed Burkina Faso's politics. "We underestimated his attachment to procedure. More importantly, we underestimated the power of public attention." They reviewed the footage from the courtroom, analyzing each moment of the confrontation. The judge's decision to stand, his command for the officers to halt, Traore's dignified response. Each element had combined to create a narrative they had not anticipated and could not control. "The direct approach is compromised," the foreign operative concluded. "Too much scrutiny now. Every move will be watched, analyzed, reported." "So we adapt," the local man replied. "There are other ways to achieve the same result, less dramatic, more effective." They began planning their next phase, a campaign of gradual pressure designed to isolate Traore from his support base, undermine his credibility, and create the conditions for his eventual removal without the messy theater of public confrontation. Economic sanctions targeting his supporters, media campaigns questioning his mental stability, diplomatic pressure on regional allies, legal harassment of his family members, a death by 1,000 cuts rather than a single dramatic blow. "The goal remains the same," the foreign operative reminded his colleague. "Traore's influence must be neutralized, the anti-corruption campaign must be stopped, the sovereignty rhetoric must be silenced. The timeline hasn't changed." "Understood, but the methods will be more subtle." As they concluded their meeting, neither man noticed the small recording device hidden beneath the conference table, placed there by a cleaning woman whose son had been inspired by Captain Traore's speeches about dignity and self-determination. Within 48 hours of the courtroom confrontation, a carefully orchestrated media campaign began across West Africa and Europe. International news outlets that had initially praised Justice Konaté's stand began running follow-up stories questioning the long-term implications of the ruling. "Legal experts express concern about judicial interference in security matters," read one headline in a prominent French newspaper. "Regional stability threatened by military strongman's legal victory," proclaimed another in a London-based publication. The stories were professionally written, well-sourced, and subtly damaging. They didn't directly attack Traore or the judge, but they created an atmosphere of doubt about the wisdom of the court's decision and the stability of Burkina Faso's institutions. Local media outlets began receiving anonymous tips about Traore's alleged financial irregularities, his family's business dealings, his mental health, his relationships with other military officers. Most of the information was unverifiable, much of it was fabricated, but all of it created a drumbeat of negative coverage that slowly began to erode the positive narrative from the courtroom victory. The most insidious stories focused on the economic consequences of political instability, foreign investors expressing concern, development projects being reconsidered, international aid potentially being reduced. The message was clear: standing up for principle was admirable, but it came with costs that ordinary citizens would ultimately bear. Fatimata Sawadobo, the young lawyer who had defended Traore, found herself particular target of this campaign. Anonymous posts on social media questioned her competence, her motivations, her personal life. Senior lawyers who had initially congratulated her began distancing themselves. Law firms that had expressed interest in hiring her suddenly found reasons to reconsider. The pressure was subtle but relentless, designed to make anyone thinking of supporting Traore understand that there would be personal consequences for their choice. Justice Konate's experience was similar but more intense. His phone stopped ringing with congratulations and began receiving calls questioning his judgment, his objectivity, his fitness for office. Colleagues who had worked with him for years began avoiding him in the corridors of the courthouse. Administrative staff became formal and distant. His daughter in Abidjan called, her voice tight with worry. "Papa, there are stories in the newspapers here. They're saying you made a political decision, that you overstepped your authority." "What do you think, my child?" he asked gently. "I think you did what you believed was right. But Papa, people are asking questions about our family, about my job, about the children's school. They're suggesting that maybe we've been influenced by Captain Traore's supporters." The implication was clear. His stand in the courtroom had not only put his own career at risk, but had potentially compromised his family's carefully built life in Abidjan. As he closed the evening, alone in his chambers, Justice Konate opened the briefcase that had been left in his home, the money that represented security, comfort, and silence. He had not returned it, had not reported it, had simply hidden it and tried to forget it existed. Now it seemed to mock him. He had chosen principle over reward, but the reward was still there, still available, still capable of solving the problems his principles had created. He closed the briefcase and locked it in his office safe, not because he had decided to keep the money, but because he wasn't yet ready to decide what to do with it. While the media war raged in newspapers and on television, a different kind of response was building in the streets, markets, and neighborhoods of Ouagadougou. The people who had watched the courtroom drama unfold understood something that the professional commentators missed. They had witnessed not just a legal proceeding, but a moment of dignity in a world that offered too few such moments.
In the Grand Marché, vendors who had never spoken about politics began discussing the judge who had stood up to pressure and the soldier who had faced down intimidation. In the university, students who had become cynical about their country's institutions saw in Justice Konate's stand proof that principled leadership was still possible. Most importantly, in the mosques and churches, in the traditional councils and youth organizations, people began talking about what they had seen and what it meant for their own lives. If a judge could resist pressure from powerful forces, if a soldier could maintain dignity under threat, what did that say about their own capacity for courage? The conversations were quiet, careful, conducted among trusted friends and family members, but they were widespread, and they began to create a different narrative from the one being promoted in the international media. Aminata Ouedraoga, a market trader who had worked for 30 years to build her small business, explained it to her daughter. "These people think they can buy and sell everything. Our gold, our cotton, our politicians, our judges. Today we saw that some things are not for sale." Her daughter, a university student studying law, nodded thoughtfully. "But Mama, what happens when they get angry that someone won't be bought?" "Then we find out what we're really made of, child." Within a week, the subtle economic campaign against Burkina Faso began to manifest in concrete ways. A major mining contract that had been under negotiation was suddenly postponed, pending reassessment of the political climate. A European Development Bank delayed approval of a crucial infrastructure loan, citing governance concerns. Foreign businesses that employed thousands of Burkinabe workers began conducting routine reviews of their operations, with clear implications that continued political uncertainty could lead to scaled-back investments. The message was unmistakable. The courtroom victory had been Pyrrhic. Principle was admirable, but it didn't pay salaries or fund development projects. President Kabore, who had remained carefully neutral during the courtroom drama, now found himself under intense pressure from multiple directions. Foreign ambassadors requested private meetings to express their concerns about stability and governance. Business leaders warned about the economic consequences of political uncertainty.
Opposition politicians demanded that he distance himself from both Traore and the judge who had protected him. In a carefully worded statement, the president's office announced that, while the government respected judicial independence, it remained committed to constitutional order, regional stability, and the rule of law as understood by the international community. The statement was diplomatic enough to avoid directly criticizing Justice Konaté's decision, but clear enough to signal that the government would not defend it against international pressure. Captain Traore understood the nature of the campaign being waged against him, and he responded in the way he knew best, by taking his case directly to the people. Instead of hiding behind lawyers and public relations specialists, he began making public appearances across Burkina Faso. Not political rallies or media events, but visits to schools, hospitals, markets, and villages, where he could speak directly to ordinary citizens about his vision for their country's future. His message was simple and consistent. They want you to believe that dignity is expensive, that sovereignty is dangerous, that standing up for yourselves will make you poor. I tell you that the opposite is true. Poverty comes from accepting that others have the right to control your resources, your leaders, your future. The crowds that gathered to hear him were not the choreographed audiences of typical political events. They were farmers concerned about land rights, students worried about their future prospects, workers frustrated by stagnant wages while foreign companies extracted billions in natural resources. His most powerful speech came at the University of Ouagadougou, where he addressed a crowd of young people who had grown up hearing that globalization and foreign investment were their only paths to prosperity. They tell you that if you demand too much, if you expect too much, if you believe you deserve too much, the investors will leave, the aid will stop, the world will abandon you. I ask you, what kind of development requires you to accept permanent subordination? What kind of prosperity demands that you remain poor so that others can become rich from your resources? The speech was broadcast live on local radio and streamed online, reaching millions of people across West Africa. Within hours, clips were being shared across social media platforms, translated into multiple languages, and discussed in online forums from Dakar to Lagos to Accra. The response was immediate and powerful. Young people who had never engaged in political activity began organizing discussion groups. University students started chapters of dignity societies dedicated to studying and promoting African self-determination. Musicians began writing songs inspired by the courtroom confrontation and Traore's speeches. The growing popular response to Traore's message created a problem for the international forces working to neutralize his influence. Their campaign had been predicated on the assumption that they could isolate him from his support base, make him appear dangerous and unstable, and gradually erode his credibility. Instead, their pressure tactics had begun to backfire. Each economic sanction, each diplomatic warning, each media attack seemed to validate Traore's arguments about foreign interference and economic manipulation. The very efforts to silence him were becoming proof of his central thesis. European diplomatic cables, later leaked to international media, revealed the depth of concern among Western governments about what they termed the Traore phenomenon. Subject has successfully transformed from a regional military figure into a pan-African symbol of resistance, read one classified assessment. Continued pressure risks elevating him to martyr status and further legitimizing his anti-Western rhetoric. Another cable warned economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation appear to be strengthening rather than weakening popular support for Subject's message. Recommend reassessment of current strategy. but reassessment proved difficult. Too much had been invested in the campaign against Traore to simply abandon it. Too many commitments had been made to regional allies about containing his influence. Too many business interests were at stake to allow his anti-corruption message to spread unchallenged. The result was an escalation of tactics that would ultimately test not just Traore's courage, but the commitment of everyone who had supported him. 3 weeks after the courtroom confrontation, Justice Konaté was working late in his chambers when his security guard knocked on the door.
Your Honor, there are some men here to see you. They say it's about your family. The judge's blood ran cold. He had been expecting retaliation, but he had hoped it would remain focused on his professional life rather than extending to his loved ones. The same well-dressed men who had visited him before entered his chambers, but their demeanor had changed. The polite threats and subtle pressure had been replaced by something harder, more direct. Justice Konaté, the lead man began, without preamble, "Your decision in the Traore case has created complications for many people, including your family." He placed a manila envelope on the judge's desk. "Your daughter's work permit in Abidjan has been flagged for review. Questions have been raised about the source of her children's school fees. Immigration authorities are expressing interest in her residency status." Justice Konaté opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were official documents, investigations, inquiries, reviews that would make his family's life in Côte d'Ivoire a bureaucratic nightmare. "This is just the beginning," the man continued, "unless, of course, you decide that your previous ruling was made in error. Legal precedent allows for reconsideration when new evidence comes to light." "What new evidence?" Justice Konaté asked. "Evidence that Captain Traore poses a greater security risk than initially assessed. Evidence that detention is necessary to prevent flight or interference with ongoing investigations. Evidence that you, as a responsible jurist, should have considered more carefully." The man stood to leave. "The next hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks from today. You have that long to decide whether your principles are worth your family's future." Captain Traore learned of the pressure being applied to Justice Konaté through the same network of supporters who had been recording the meetings of his enemies. The cleaning woman, whose son had been inspired by his speeches, had continued her covert intelligence gathering, and the recordings she provided painted a clear picture of the escalating campaign against everyone who had supported him. Sitting in his quarters, listening to the recorded conversations that detailed threats against the judge's family, economic pressure on his lawyer, intimidation of his supporters, Traore faced the most difficult decision of his life. He could continue fighting, knowing that his resistance would bring increasing pressure on innocent people who had shown him loyalty. Or he could surrender, accepting whatever consequences awaited him in exchange for protecting those who had stood by him. His aide, Lieutenant Sankara, found him staring out the window as dawn broke over Ouagadougou. "Captain, sir, the morning briefing is ready." "Tell me, Lieutenant," Traore said without turning around, "what do you think makes a man a leader?" "Sir, is it the willingness to fight when the costs fall on himself, or the wisdom to know when continued fighting will harm those who trusted him?" Lieutenant Sankara was quiet for a long moment. "I think, sir, that real leadership means accepting responsibility for all the consequences of your choices, including the consequences for other people." Traore nodded slowly. "Prepare a statement, Lieutenant."
I want to address the nation tonight." That evening, Captain Ibrahim Traore appeared on national television for what many assumed would be his surrender. The studio was simple: a single chair, a microphone, the flag of Burkina Faso in the background. No crowd, no supporters, no theatrical elements that might distract from his words. "My fellow citizens," he began, "3 weeks ago you witnessed something remarkable in a courtroom in our capital. You saw a judge stand up for the law, despite pressure to abandon it. You saw officers hesitate when confronted with moral authority. You saw that principles still matter, that dignity still has power, that justice is still possible." He paused, looking directly into the camera. "Since that day, those who would prefer that such things not happen have worked tirelessly to ensure they never happen again. They have threatened the families of those who showed courage. They have applied economic pressure to our nation. They have used every tool at their disposal to punish anyone who dared to believe that we deserve better." The television audience across Burkina Faso and beyond grew silent, waiting for what seemed like an inevitable capitulation. "I am told that if I surrender myself to them, if I accept detention and trial on their terms, if I abandon the principles for which we have stood, then this pressure will cease. The judge's family will be safe. Our economy will stabilize. The international community will smile upon us once again." Another pause. When he continued, his voice was stronger. "But I have learned something these past weeks. I have learned that surrender is not the opposite of resistance. It is the beginning of a different kind of resistance. They can imprison my body, but they cannot imprison the idea that we deserve dignity. They can silence my voice, but they cannot silence the voices of young people who have heard that message and made it their own." He stood from his chair, the camera following him. "Therefore, I announce tonight that I will voluntarily surrender myself to the authorities tomorrow morning. Not because I have done anything wrong, but because I refuse to allow my resistance to be used as justification for harming innocent people." The shock was visible on the faces of viewers across the nation. This was not the surrender they had expected, nor the resistance they had hoped for. It was something more complex, more challenging. But let me be clear about what this surrender means and what it does not mean. It means that one man is willing to pay the price for his principles. It does not mean that those principles are wrong. It means that I trust you, the students, the farmers, the workers, the young people who have heard our message, to carry these ideas forward. His voice rose with passion. "They believe that by removing one man, they can kill an idea. They are wrong. The idea that Africa deserves dignity, that our resources should benefit our people, that our leaders should serve our interests rather than foreign interests, these ideas are not mine alone. They belong to everyone who has ever dreamed of a better future." The speech concluded with a challenge that would resonate far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Tomorrow, they will arrest one man. But tonight, I ask you, will you let them arrest the idea of African dignity? Will you let them imprison the dream of true independence? Will you let them silence the voice that says we deserve better? As the broadcast ended, Traore sat back down in the simple chair, removed his microphone, and prepared for his final night of freedom. The next morning, Captain Ibrahim Traore walked out of his quarters and into the custody of the same officers who had tried to arrest him in the courtroom 3 weeks earlier. This time, there was no judge to protect him, no public forum to witness his treatment, no legal authority to challenge their actions. But something fundamental had changed. The arrest was covered by every major news outlet in Africa and many around the world. The image of Traore walking calmly to the police vehicle, his head high and his dignity intact, became one of the most widely circulated photographs of the year. More importantly, his final speech had been heard by millions of people across the continent who recognized in his words their own frustrations, their own hopes, their own dreams of a future where African dignity was not negotiable. In universities from Lagos to Nairobi, students organized dignity societies dedicated to studying and promoting African self-determination. In mining communities from Ghana to Zambia, workers began questioning why foreign companies extracted billions in resources while local communities remained poor. In parliaments from Senegal to Tanzania, young politicians began asking uncomfortable questions about foreign aid, debt structures, and economic dependency. Justice Konaté, faced with the impossible choice between his family's safety and his professional integrity, ultimately recused himself from Traore's case. In a private letter to the captain, he wrote, "You have taught me that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from winning, but from making the cost of defeat too high for those who would destroy justice." The trials that followed, both legal and political, would continue for years, but the idea that had been planted in that Ouagadougou courtroom, nurtured by a judge's courage and a soldier's sacrifice, had taken root across a continent where young people were no longer willing to accept that dignity was a luxury they could not afford. In the end, they had tried to arrest one man in a courtroom. Instead, they had awakened a continent to the possibility that justice, dignity, and true independence were not just dreams, but achievable realities worth fighting for. The story of Captain Ibrahim Traore and Justice Amadou Konaté became more than a news event. It became a reminder that in the darkest moments, when power seems absolute and resistance seems futile, ordinary people can still choose to stand for something greater than themselves. And sometimes that choice changes everything.